Hello, I'm Frank Brown, a senior program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise and the head of the anti-corruption value chain team at CIPE. I'm joined today by Richard Bistrong. Good to have you here, Richard.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And we're here to talk about anti-corruption compliance and dig a bit into one of Richard's areas of expertise, which we'll get to in a second, which informs, to a large extent, the work we do at CIPE on anti-corruption. First, I'll give you a few words about Richard's background to put this discussion in some context. So Richard spent much of his career as an international sales executive. He currently consults and speaks on foreign bribery, ethics, and compliance issues, and he does that from a frontline perspective. Richard was the vice president of international sales for a large, publicly traded manufacturer of police and military equipment, which included residing and working in the UK. In 2007, as part of a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice and a subsequent immunity from prosecution agreement in the UK, Richard assisted the United States, the UK, and other governments in their understanding of how FCPA, bribery, and other export violations occurred and operated in international sales. In 2012, Richard was sentenced as part of his own plea agreement and served 14 and a half months at a federal prison camp, returning home in December of 2013. Richard now consults, writes, and speaks about current frontline anti-bribery and compliance issues. He was named one of Ethisphere's 100 most influential in business ethics for 2015 and is a contributing editor of the FCPA blog. Richard's chapter, The Anatomy of a Bribe, appears in the 2016 edition of Trace International's How to Pay a Bribe. Richard was also recognized by J.D. Supra as top author in the 2016 Reader's Choice Awards for compliance. Richard, again, it's good to have you here.
Thank you, Frank.
One of the things that we at CIPE talk a lot about, and I think has become a subject of discussion within the anti-corruption and compliance community overall, both on the commercial side and with policymakers inside governments, with donor agencies, with think tanks. One of the subjects is something that I think is dear to your heart, is how we get beyond simply changing behaviors to changing value systems and notions of what ethics inform people's behavior in the workplace. And this is of special interest to CIPE because it has all sorts of consequences for society generally.
Sure.
And the way a democracy functions. So I wanted to ask you, what in your opinion can we do more of to reach that perhaps somewhat utopian goal of altering people's ethical systems?
Well, it's a great question, Frank. There's a wonderful book called Blind Spots that's co-authored by Anne Ten-Brunsell and I believe Max Bazerman. And it talks about the contortion and the failure, it talks about the failure of compliance systems, in part in how it contorts the decision-making process, where people are just thinking of and indexing their behavior to rules, policies, and procedures, and are not thinking about the wider ethical consequences and the implications, intended or unintended, of their decisions. So I think for people who work on the front lines of international business, far away from home, in some of these frontier and emerging markets, that understanding the societal consequences of corruption is an integral part of expanding their thinking in terms of anti-bribery compliance is just not a policy, it's a philosophy, right? It's not that we don't bribe because compliance says we can't. We don't bribe because that's just not how we do business. Because we understand what the unintended consequences are of bribery on governance, on human rights, on economic development. And the wonderful thing about this is there are some really great works out right now. And most people on the front lines, they spend a lot of time in airplanes. So I know they have a lot of time to read, or at least they have some discretionary time. Sarah Chayes, Thieves of State. Tom Burgess wrote The Looting Machine. Ken Silverstein wrote The Secret World of Oil. And, Sarah Chayes specifically talks about how certain regimes, they're just masquerading as governments, but what they are criminal enterprises. And people really need to think about, even if it's a small bribe, do I want to be in the ecosystem of a criminal enterprise? Do I want to be a part of robbing the local population of economic development, education, health and welfare? So I think the wonderful thing is, we've got Transparency International, got some wonderful books and authors that should almost be as integral a part of anti-bribery education as studying the rule book, as doing the online training, to become a sort of an ethical ambassador, understanding why it is we have these laws.
That's a fascinating point, because I think that often we don't, in our discussion of corruption, think about the consequences that aren't purely commercial. And you're right, one of the reasons that CIPE has taken such an interest and put such resources into this issue is that there are human rights repercussions, and there are all sorts of unintended consequences when it comes to the stability of a state or the healthiness of a democracy. But Richard, if we look beyond sort of trying to help, say, compliance officers or folks who works overseas for multinational corporations, helping them understand what the consequences are, if we go inside the emerging markets and we look at the evolution of economies and the increasing sophistication and their increasing integration into global markets, how do you see those processes, which inherently include paying more attention to compliance issues, how do you see those processes tied towards ethical issues and framing the need to change compliance behaviors in a broader way that touches on larger themes?
Yeah, and as you know from your own experience and being a correspondent in Moscow, that in these societies, not everyone shares our concerns. So to where corruption might be how things get done in some of these countries, where you have weak state institutions, procurement personnel are poorly paid, inadequately trained, the rules of procurement are marked by secrecy, and there's not really the political will to investigate, prosecute corruption. It's tough, right? So for Western multinationals to find responsible partners in those countries, I think really it's a little bit of a bicycle ride uphill, right? You got to keep pedaling to make progress. But they're there, and they might be in certain segments and not others. I mean, I think a lot of companies sometimes reject the brand of a country. Like, we don't want to do business in country X, that's dirty.
Yeah.
But a deeper drill, you might find that there are certain markets and certain business partners that are really embracing the ethics of doing business the right way, embracing international anti-bribery conventions. So a company just has to have the digestive system and to some extent the resources to do that work up front to get sort of a clear-eyed view of what that landscape looks like. And, we live in this world of hyper-transparency. It's not just the legal part of it, but what are all the different relationships? Are there local labor issues? Does a third party have a disruptive relationship with an NGO? So I think in today's environment, and Allison Taylor and James Cohn, we just had a really interesting exchange about that we've got to look at the wider landscape is just be on the legal side of this, and to realize that everybody's seeing everything these days.
Now that's a very good point, because I've found in my work with trade facilitation, which is the other hat that I wear at CIPE, that we're seeing a much more sort of integrated, holistic approach to these issues, because you have free trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific
That's
Partnership that include not only dimensions regarding transparency, which would touch upon corruption, but also environmental provisions,
That's right.
labor provisions, and we're beginning to see, I think, this holistic approach, which is very, very healthy, but often the glue that holds together dysfunctional systems in an emerging market is corruption.
Right.
And that sort of feeds into my next question for you, which is, so it's fine and dandy to have all these standards, and we can watch closely the latest settlements from the DOJ to try to divine where the boundaries are and what's acceptable and what's not. But when you actually get out there on the front line, and they may not have heard about any of this, and this is the sort of foreign world that they don't expect to ever touch them.
Right.
What kind of steps can you take to help mid-sized enterprises reconcile that difference, to close the gap between the standards that we're forced to adhere to and the reality on the ground?
So I don't mean to sound like a book review today, but there's another great work by Jonathan Berman called Success in Africa. Mm-hmm. And he talks about companies like General Electric and IBM that did just what you talked about. And I think if there's a key word that is similar in all of these different scenarios and transactions that he described, it's long-term vision. Mm. Okay? It's being able to go into one of these countries and say, we want to educate a local workforce. We want to invest in local resources. We want to develop local business. We want to participate fairly, but we want to do it in partnership with you. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're not bringing in tons of expats. This is not about sort of that imperial investment. It's about a shared value, shared for the shareholders of the multinational and shared for the society at large. And companies like General Electric, Coke and Pepsi, IBM that have done that, over the long term, they have been able to develop sustainable businesses in countries that superficially you might say there's no way. But not everybody, Frank, has the balance sheet of General Electric and IBM and are willing to say, we'll send a sales team and even a C-suite team in there a couple of times a year, repeat visits, and this might take 3 or 4 years, but we think long term, the people want a power generator. Mm-hmm. You know, they want a sustainable healthcare system. Right. So we think in the long term, we'll win because the population's going to want that and the government's going to want that. So I think the biggest thing is being patient.
Okay. And having the long view. And
Absolutely.
What do you, but that long view to a certain extent is predicated upon the belief that the kind of dynamic we've witnessed over the past few decades regarding globalization, trade agreements, integration will continue. And as we see in the current election cycle here in the US, when it comes to discussing free trade agreements, as we saw with Brexit, the recent Brexit vote, right, it seems like we're at an inflection point where maybe there's some doubt as to the benefits to that, and countries are looking more inward and less sort of outward at the way that they're all related to each other. Do you see a downside to that in terms of what you're talking about? In terms of a sense of shared values and a belief in the long-term ability of some of these emerging markets to embrace a corporate culture that is sustainable and good, not just for the corporations themselves, but for the broader society?
So I think in the emerging markets, a lot of the discourse and debate over Brexit and some of the free trade agreements sort of in the West may not be as valuable of an issue, as valued as of an issue for them as it is for us, because I think most of them see themselves, and CIPE's done some great papers on this, they realize that their long-term success is in partnerships with the global supply chain. So I don't think they see it as coming apart, but the question is, and I think maybe when they start, I mean, we have global corruption scandals right now.
Right.
We have, what is it, 1MDB in Malaysia. We have Unaoil. We've got FIFA. So I think the message of the international law enforcement community is taking this seriously. We have evidence being collected in Singapore and Switzerland and being certified in the United States through the MLAT treaties. So I think they're realizing that it works carrots and sticks.
Okay.
That if you do this in the wrong way, you might end up way down on the supply chain in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Okay.
So I think the deterrence, or at least the awareness of what can happen if it goes wrong, even if you're just a small party to these issues, is enormous. I think that might be having an impact.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it's a very good point. I wanted to ask you a bit about the way that industries deal with changing markets and demand. So specifically looking at the energy sector, and we look at the drop in oil prices, in natural gas prices, and we're seeing a higher incidence of fraud and corruption in those areas. And I know from my own experience in certain countries that's explained by the pie shrinking and bureaucrats or whomever being reliant upon revenue streams, seeing those revenue streams reduced, and so becoming more avaricious. But I'd be interested in your take on this.
Yeah, I think that once you see an industry where the business model is starting to change, okay, so oil and gas, where just the per barrel price is having a huge impact on the entire marketplace, it's a scary time. Because I think everybody wants to try to grab the last dollar on the local side in the emerging market community, where the producer states. But where I see real peril is on the multinational side, as business development teams might be hearing the voice of get the business done. We need to make up for these revenue shortfalls. We're in a very difficult market environment right now. We need to try to recapture share. That voice starts to sound a lot louder than we still care how you get the business done. So I think it's a little bit of a perfect storm in that you might have a rush for that sort of last wave of corruption on the local side as the amount of money diminishes. But what concerns me are the people on the front lines that might be getting less compliance support because expenses are the first thing to go in this environment. I've worked for a public company. I know how that goes. So you've got less compliance support and more business pressure to succeed. I think that could put people in a very difficult position in terms of thinking, how do I need to get this done, far away from home?
And how do you counteract that? What sort of measures can you take to get ahead of that?
So I think the company has to be very strategic about it and to say, we recognize this environment. We know that it's difficult. Yes, we need to have a plan B and a get well plan to try to recapture market share, but that doesn't lower the voice or the volume of the importance of how you get the business done, your role as an ethical ambassador, and to continue to be our compliance deputy out there. So, yes, we have some challenges here, but we're not going to overcome them by cutting corners.
Okay.
So that volume control has to stay really high during these times.
And Richard, have you seen any evidence that enforcement mechanisms of, the DOJ, FCPA unit, for example, see that happening in the energy industry and are ramping up their efforts?
It's hard to tell because we only see things when they're either disclosed in a financial filing
Right.
or when the Department of Justice or the SEC issues a press release. But we know from public disclosures, for example, with Unaoil,
Right.
including as recently as yesterday when the Serious Fraud Office said they're starting to investigate it. We know that there are U.S. multinationals that have already disclosed that they're talking to the Justice Department. So, we've been down this road before in the oil and gas business. So I always hate to comment on an ongoing case, and we don't really know what's going on behind closed doors, but it does seem to still be an issue out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is very helpful for us at CIPE because many of the markets we work in are resource rich. And
Absolutely.
so I think as we see investigations like Unaoil unfold, that may have knock-on effects for years to come in the markets where we are active.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know if that resource curse gets worse as commodity prices go down, or if it forces countries to look elsewhere for development.
That'll be fascinating to watch,
Yeah.
because that would be a healthy outcome, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for joining us. And I wanted to ask if folks want to be in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out?
Well, thank you for asking. I hope we get to continue the conversation, and I can be reached quite easily right on my website, which is www.richardbistrong.com.
And Bistrong spelled?
Bistrong.
Okay. Richard, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.